What does the healthy human specimen look like? I know already as I'm wording it that way, that makes me sound like I'm some alien that's trying to study humanity as I've arrived on Earth. But that is the point of today's book. I'm trying to understand via this book, and that's the whole point of it as well, about what it is that makes up a self-actualized, healthy human. When I talk about this idea of being a specimen, that is directly the language of Abraham Maslow in his wonderful book, Toward a Psychology of Being. When we look at this, he writes in this beautifully, technically precise way. And it's so useful because it helps to give us a really clear structure and set of rules and propositions to live by when we start to consider what a healthy person should look like, because then we can also then reverse engineer the process in terms of who is it that I am in relation to this ideal person and what do I specifically need to work on. So one thing that can be really, really useful, because I want to make this as practical as possible straight away, is on page 46. He's got this lovely little diagram, which you might be able to, hopefully this is in focus, I can't actually quite tell. But he's got this lovely little diagram on here about safety and growth vectors. Hopefully that makes sense and you're able to either pause it or screenshot it. But I just want to talk through this because this is something that I use legitimately on a weekly, if not daily basis. And this has made life so much easier for me. So on that diagram, we've got the person in the middle. It's very similar to the choice point model, actually, when we talked about it on the previous one. In the middle, we can move towards safety and we can move towards growth. I'll write out a simplified version of this in the comments as well. But what we need to do is we need to consider 4 things. How do we enhance the growth vectors? By that, I mean, how do we enhance how good the positives actually are when we consider growth overall? So let's say you've identified a value that you want to move towards. What are the best possible versions of that value? What would you look like if you move towards it? That part's quite straightforward. Part B is to minimize the fears of growth. So it might be you actually start to worry about the type of person that you would become if you started to embody that trait. The fear of success is extremely relevant, but people don't often talk about this. So we need to consider the fear of failure as well as the fear of success and learn to consciously minimize the dangers of being that type of person as well. So it might be, for example, if let's say you want to prioritize physical fitness and you think, what happens if I get so big that suddenly men start to see me as a challenge and I don't want to start fights with them? That might be a worry just off the top of my head that somebody might have if they were to be successful when they consider physical fitness. It's understanding that we need to enhance the attraction of being physically fit, but minimize the realistic dangers about what would happen if you were to actually manage that. Again, moving over to the safety side of this to help make it as clear as possible, we need to minimize the safety vectors. So what I'm saying there is, although it can be very, very tempting to think about what would happen if you didn't make any changes and you played life safe, what we need to do is realize that, yeah, there is a certain amount of safety there, but we need to minimize the attractiveness of that, because if we just fall in love with this idea of staying exactly where we are, so no change is actually going to happen. No life is going to be lived. No experiences are going to be had. So we need to make sure we're minimizing the allure of what it is to be overly safe. And equally, part D on this is going to be to maximize the fears of safety, defensiveness, pathology, and regression is how it's worded in here. In other words, we're maximizing the danger. So what we're trying to think about here is what would happen in the worst case scenario if you just played it safe all the time? What would you actually start to miss out on if you chose not to grow and just stay safe all the time overall? Because if we can keep these 4 things in balance, and like I say, I'll write this out in the comment section to make it as practical as possible for you. We need to realize that at any given point, we're in the middle of all this. We're being pushed and pulled in different directions. And it can be a really, really useful and practical exercise to be able to write down the answers that you would have to parts A, B, C, and D. It's realizing that actually you're a dynamic agent. You've got autonomy. You've got control over this. But you've got to be able to pull yourself towards that future that you want to have. Another way of wording this in terms of like this book itself is this idea of being values compared to deficiency values. You want to move towards a fullness of being, good qualities to have, things like joy and spontaneity and kindness. We want to move towards this free-flowing way of living compared to living in a deficiency-based way. Another way of saying that would be to do with fear. Much more to do with avoidance rather than the acceptance of certain things. Because if we're too focused on fear, we're going to be very rigid. We're going to be very structured in our approach. And actually, one of the things that makes up a healthy human specimen for Abraham Maslow is this idea that there's an adaptability, there's a spontaneousness, there's a realization that we might not be able to do this in the way that we pictured, but we can adapt to the situation. That's why the book actually ends in a beautiful way in terms of giving 43 specific propositions on what it is to be a healthy human. Yeah, 43. So in that case there, you can go through it. And if you can start to realize how you're living in accordance with these rules, you might start to realize why certain parts of your life are going well and certain parts of them are struggling, or you're finding a lot more difficulty with it. As we start to understand our wider capacities, he's got this beautiful phrase in the book that our capacities clamour to be used. If you're feeling a little bit empty or a little bit unenthusiastic or unvital or unalive at this point in time in your life, it's probably because there's a capacity within you that is trying to seek full expression, but for some reason, maybe due to fear, you're not quite allowing it to be fully expressed. The point of this is to have the courage to be able to do that. If you're worried about how other people might, for example, relate to your art, let's say you want to be really creative, but you're worried that people might judge you for it, instead of focusing on the other people's responses and reception to it, focus on what it is to be a person who is creating art just for the love of art itself. Because that capacity exists within you, especially if you really connect with that as an idea, that value and that trait. And you need to see it in the world, because if you don't, it's going to be in the back of your head as an unconscious material somewhere back here, eating away at you. There's going to be a reason why you're feeling this, maybe a lack of passion, this lack of vitality towards life. One thing that's been so useful for me in building this library project is realizing that I knew that I liked teaching to begin with. I've been a teacher for 10 years, but I really love teaching, not just being in a classroom and teaching, although I do love that as well. I love the process of gaining the knowledge, making order out of the chaos, and learning how to articulate it, and then being in service to another person, maybe to you at this point in time. I love that process and that packaging. And if you like a similar idea to this, you can actually take this book a lot further, because the follow-up to Toward a Psychology of Being is this one. I'll recommend it as a little hidden book on all of this. The Farther Reaches of Human Nature, where this book here, Toward a Psychology of Being, will focus much more on self-actualization, about being the fullest version of you that you can be. This one is going to focus much more on self-transcendence, what happens above and beyond self-actualization. So that's how can you be in service to other people? What does it mean to be a human in a society of other humans? And when we start to really talk about these capacities that clamour to be used, that's when it's going to be really called into question, because you can only get a certain amount of satisfaction by building yourself up. The real satisfaction comes when you're able to do that and then also be in service to another person. That's what this entire YouTube channel is going to be based on, and it is based on. It's the idea that I'm making sense of all of this, but I'm promoting Autobibliotherapy. Auto, self or self-directed, biblio, books or library, therapy referring to healing. Autobibliotherapy, self-directed healing via books. I'm not here to say I've got all this knowledge and you can only access it through me. I'm encouraging you to read these books, to read from the masters and learn from them in the same way that I'm doing it. Where possible, I will share my experience and share some of the insights that I've had and some of the exercises that will be particularly useful. But there's no comparison to sitting down and engaging with a book like this and reading it and making notes in it as well. You'll be able to see, like in all of these books that I hold up, I'm highlighting, I'm making notes on certain pages. I'm learning how to use this as a guide so that a year from now, that version of Billy can look back at what this version of Billy thought was important. And I can keep that conversation going, not just between me and the author, or this author and all the other authors, and me and all these other authors, but also me and another version of me. I'm creating this community, as I said in the previous video, this community of selves as I start to manage all this. But I can only do that by considering who I am in relation to safety and growth. And I need to maximize my chances to move towards growth and minimize my chances of just settling for safety, because that is how I'm going to self-actualize. That is ultimately how I'm going to be of more service to other people. That's how I'm going to be able to be, in the long run, self-transcending, even if it's difficult in the short term. And that's how it comes back round to the previous video and the previous book in this series with ACT. It's understanding at any point I'm at a choice point, and I can either be settling for short-term comfort or long-term fulfillment, knowing exactly what's going to hook me away. If I can identify my coping mechanisms and my addictions, I can come up with strategies to be able to minimize that approach to stay on that path for long-term fulfillment. But all of that can only come about by, for me, sitting down with these books, engaging with them, thinking about them, having insights, and putting those insights into practical application as well. So the final book in this series is Toward a Psychology of Being by Abraham Maslow. And in the next video, I'm going to do a top 3 overall. Little hint, this is going to be one of them. And as I want to think about this is, if you can only read 3 books this year, it's going to be these 3 that have got the maximum impact that you can use on an ongoing basis. That way, if it took you 4 months to read a single book, you could still manage it in that space of a year. So if that idea excites you and interests you, I'm going to summarize and finish this playlist on the next video with this book and 2 others from this series. If that interests you, come and join me on the next video.